Hello, and welcome to this screencast on the assessment of activity limitations and impairments in pediatric clients. After watching this screencast, you will be able to describe 6 assessments of activity limitations and impairments of body structure and function. You will also be able to explain how each of these assessments relates to a child's participation in the natural environment. Before we begin our discussion of the assessment tools, I want you to take a moment to think about a child's typical day. What do you think a child needs to be able to do to participate with his family at home? What about with his friends at school? What do you think a child would like to do with his family and friends in the community? Pause the video and jot down a few of the activities you thought of. Now, looking at your list, I want you to reflect upon how you might measure these activities objectively. In this screencast, we will explore some of the assessments that will allow you to do that. Our assessment of children with disabilities is built on the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, also known as the ICF model. The ICF describes the interaction among all the factors that can affect a child's function. Our assessment must address each of these levels of the ICF to obtain a holistic picture of the child. The ICF defines participation restrictions as problems an individual may experience in involvement in life situations. Activity limitations are difficulties an individual may have in executing tasks. Impairments are problems in body function or structures. In our previous screencast, we discussed assessments of participation restrictions. In this screencast, we will focus on the activity limitations and impairments. Another framework I would like you to consider is the top-down approach to assessment. When we are assessing a child, we always want to start with the participation restrictions. From there, we can move on to assessing the specific tasks the child needs to achieve in order to improve participation. Finally, we will assess for the presence of impairments that may interfere with task performance. We will first explore the activity limitations domain, including the timed up and go, the timed floor to stand, and the timed up and down stairs test. The timed up and go was first designed as an assessment of fall risk in elderly patients. It has since been modified as a means of assessing mobility in children. The test requires the child to stand up from a chair, walk 12 feet, turn around, return to the chair, and sit back down. The therapist measures the time it takes the child to complete this task. The test assesses several components required for mobility within the school or classroom, including transitioning between sitting and standing and walking with changes in direction. Results on the TUG have been correlated with measures of gait speed, postural sway, functional mobility, and the level of assistance a child needs from a caregiver. The timed floor to stand is a modification of the timed up and go. Instead of starting in a seated position on a chair, the child begins by sitting cross-legged on the floor. The child then stands up from the floor, walks 12 feet, turns around, and returns to sitting cross-legged behind the starting line. The timed floor to stand incorporates floor to stand transfers, which are necessary for full mobility in the home and at school. The timed up and down stairs test is a standardized assessment of stair negotiation. The child quickly walks up a flight of stairs, turns around on the landing, and quickly walks back down to the bottom of the stairs. The therapist measures the time it takes the child to complete this task. Results on the TUDS have been correlated to measures of gait speed, stride length, fall risk, ankle flexibility, and aerobic endurance. Now that we've reviewed the assessments of activity limitations, I'd like for you to pause the screencast for a moment and look back at your list of activities from the beginning of this lesson. Did the assessments we just discussed address any of the activities on your list? Next, we will review 3 measures of impairments: the pediatric reach test, the 6-minute walk test, and the 5 repetition sit-to-stand test. The pediatric reach test is an assessment of standing balance. The child reaches one arm forward as far as possible without moving her feet or taking a step. The therapist measures the distance reached, which has been correlated to force plate measurements of forward weight shifting and postural control. The 6-minute walk test was originally used with adult cardiac patients. When used with children, it is typically an assessment of submaximal aerobic capacity. However, for children with chronic cardiac or pulmonary conditions, the 6-minute walk test may represent their maximal aerobic capacity. To perform the test, the child walks continuously for 6 minutes without stopping to take a rest. The therapist may encourage the child to walk or to keep walking every 30 seconds. The therapist then measures the total distance walked in 6 minutes. The 5 repetition sit-to-stand test is an assessment of lower extremity strength. The child sits in a chair without armrests and performs 5 sit-to-stand transfers while keeping their arms crossed over their chest to prevent them from using their hands to assist. The therapist measures the time it takes for the child to complete 5 repetitions of this task. Now that we've reviewed all of the assessments in the screencast, please pause the screencast for a moment and reflect on how you would use these assessments to help you assess a child in school, at home, and in the community. Now let's apply what you've learned to some case studies. Our first case is the case of Jimmy. Jimmy's first grade teacher is concerned that he's always left behind when the class is walking from their classroom on the first floor to the gym on the second floor. The school-based physical therapist observed Jimmy during one of these transitions and noted that he lagged several steps behind the student in front of him. He demonstrated a step-over-step gait pattern throughout stair negotiation, but he held the handrail with both hands while climbing the stairs. He frequently stopped to talk to the students next to or behind him. Please pause the screencast and consider the following questions. Which assessments could the therapist use to assess Jimmy's performance of class transitions? And what information will the therapist learn from these assessments? If you set the timed up and down stairs test, you are correct. The timed up and down stairs test will enable the therapist to assess Jimmy's ability to negotiate stairs without the distraction of his peers. The therapist may also want to use the pediatric reach test to assess Jimmy's balance, as balance deficits may contribute to difficulties with stair negotiation. Our second case is the case of Matthew, a middle school student with a history of tectal glioma, which is a type of brain tumor. Matthew's middle school expects students to complete transitions between classes within 5 minutes. These transitions require negotiating 2 flights of stairs and walking 300 to 600 feet. Matthew currently requires 10 minutes to complete all transitions. He complains of fatigue after each transition and often falls asleep during his afternoon classes. Please pause the screencast again and consider which assessments could the therapist use to assess Matthew's performance of between class transitions, and what information will the therapist learn from these assessments. In this case, both the 6-minute walk test and the timed up and down stairs test would be appropriate. The 6-minute walk will enable the therapist to determine Matthew's submaximal cardiac endurance. Decreased endurance may be contributing to Matthew's inability to complete his transitions on time. Since many of Matthew's class transitions require stair negotiation, the therapist can also incorporate the timed up and down stairs test to allow him to assess Matthew's ability to negotiate stairs. For our final case, let's consider Laura, a 5-year-old child with a diagnosis of developmental delay. Laura's teacher reports she is always the last one to come to the rug when the class is transitioning to circle time. She moves much slower than her peers when standing up from the floor. Pause the screencast one last time and answer the questions. Which assessments could the therapist use to assess Laura's performance of in-class mobility? And what information will the therapist learn from these assessments? The therapist could use the timed floor to stand test to further assess Laura's ability to move to and from sitting on the rug. The therapist may also want to incorporate the timed up and go to observe differences in her performance when standing up from higher sitting surfaces. In this screencast, we reviewed several assessments of activity limitations and impairments, including the timed up and go, timed floor to stand, timed up and down stairs, pediatric reach, 5 repetition sit to stand, and 6-minute walk test. During this week's in-person meeting, you will have an opportunity to practice these assessments. In future classes, we will discuss how you can integrate assessments at all levels of the ICF to complete a holistic assessment of the child. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in class on Thursday.